Welcome. We gather here in Emancipation Hall, the Capitol Visitor Center in Washington, D.C., at the foot of the statue of Sarah Winnemucca, who was a symbolic figure in the fight for human rights of indigenous women, to demand action on a pair of bills that will help us tackle a crisis that is impacting indigenous women in my district, as well as across the country. That is the crisis of missing and murdered indigenous women. Native women face a murder rate that is 10 times the national average. 84% of women experiencing some form of violence in their lifetime. Despite these facts, there is still no reliable way of knowing how many indigenous women go missing each year, nor whose fate came in the balance of an unsolved murder case. Two bills, Savanna's Act, as well as the Not Invisible Act, will empower our Native communities, ensure law enforcement officers have the tools they need to solve cases of missing and murdered indigenous women, and finally deliver justice to the families and loved ones who have been waiting for answers far too long. These bills not only enjoy broad bipartisan support here in the House, but also unanimous support in the U.S. Senate. There's absolutely no reason that these bills should not be considered today in the U.S. House of Representatives. In fact, it is only the House that is standing in the way of them making it to the desk of President Trump and being signed into law. So I've got a message for the Speaker of the House, Ms. Pelosi. It has been 1,125 days since Savanna LaFontaine Grayway, our bill's namesake, was brutally murdered. It's been 441 days since Rosenda Strong's remains were found horrifically in an abandoned freezer in my district in Washington State. And Speaker Pelosi, it has been 190 days since the Senate unanimously passed Savanna's Act and the Not Invisible Act, which now sit on your desk, waiting to be voted. I might also add that it has been 62 days since a bipartisan group of members of the House of Representatives wrote a letter to the Speaker asking for consideration of these bills, and we have yet to hear from them. So Speaker Pelosi, today we implore you, let's not let another day go by that this chamber fails to act to address this crisis. We must act. I'd like to turn to some of my colleagues to make some comments on this very important issue. First, a gentleman from Utah, great state of Utah, Mr. Chris Stewart. Chris?
Dan, thank you for your leadership on this. Representative Newhouse, you have been really one of the tireless fighters for these issues and others like them, and I'm grateful for the invitation to be here today. And I will re-emphasize some of the things you've already said. Before I do, I'd like to begin. Most of my colleagues and many other people know that I am a family man. It's the thing that I'm most proud of. I have a wonderful wife, an amazing person, two incredible daughters. I can't imagine what it would be like as a father to have my wife or one of my children, one of my daughters missing, and to not know what happened to her, and to know that there wasn't an effective system to account for those young women that are missing, or for those that may have been murdered. I also represent the great state of Utah. We have many tribal lands in my state. We want to help these indigenous people. We realize that there is a crisis. As Mr. Newhouse already said, a murder rate not twice, not 3 times, 10 times the murder rate of the national average. And no real accountability, no way of accounting for those, especially young children, who may have gone missing. These two bills, Savanna's Act and the Not Invisible Act, would address this crisis. It would make a difference in this crisis. We owe it to these people to do something about this. And yet, like Mr. Newhouse said, it's been 190 days, more than half a year, since these two bills were passed unanimously by the United States Senate. Complete bipartisan support. And yet they sit and languish here in the House. Speaker Pelosi, please tell us why. If you care about women, and I'm sure that she does, if you care about indigenous women, and I'm sure that she does, tell us why you won't bring up these two bills. It's inexcusable. It's completely inconsistent with the message we want to send. We care about all people, including indigenous people, including indigenous women and children. For heaven's sakes, bring up these bills. We could pass them in 15 minutes. Can you not give us 15 minutes on the floor to do this? Please do it. Now I'd like to turn the time over to another great colleague of mine. He represents the Upper Midwest, one of the most beautiful places in the country. Rick, turn it to you.
Thank you very much. Representative Newhouse, thanks for your work and leadership on this. I'm very impressed, and it's the right thing to do. Hello, everyone. My name is Congressman Pete Stauber, and I come from the great state of Minnesota. You know, Native American women are experiencing violence at disturbingly high rates. So I'm glad to be here with my colleagues to highlight this crisis and stand in support of bipartisan legislation that will help eradicate this terrible injustice. As a former law enforcement officer, I believe strongly that everyone has a right to feel safe in their community. Unfortunately, my home state of Minnesota currently ranks 9th for missing and murdered indigenous women. As members of Congress, I believe that we have a moral obligation and legislative duty to protect our Native American communities from further exploitation and violence. That is why I am calling on Speaker Pelosi to bring forward both the Not Invisible Act and Savanna's Act to the House floor next week. As a co-sponsor of both these bills, I believe each will go a long way towards helping eliminate this epidemic of violence faced by Native American communities. In my opinion, these could be some of the easiest bills we pass in a bipartisan fashion this year. This isn't a Democrat issue or a Republican issue. This is an American issue, and we need to act now. With that being said, I thank my colleague, Representative Newhouse, for putting this event together, and I sincerely hope that we can pass both of these important bills next week. And now it is my honor to introduce a great member from South Dakota, Dusty Johnson.
1.5 million. That's right, 1.5 million indigenous women in this country today, during their lifetimes, have been victims of violence. When you think about the size and the scope of that tragedy, it is amazing that our country does not do more to call attention, to bring care and relief to those victims. And in recent years, 5,700 indigenous women have gone missing or have been murdered. And yet only a fraction of those have been logged by the Department of Justice. Now, when you really dive into this issue, time and time again, you come to the realization that it is a lack of data, that it is a lack of coordination, that is allowing us to tackle this problem head on. We have the tools at our disposal. We're just not using them properly. So the 116th Congress is rapidly approaching its end. And ladies and gentlemen, when I talk in weeks to come, as I have in years past, with women who have seen horrors that I cannot comprehend, women who are Oglala or who are Santee, or who are Dakota and Lakota women who live in Rosebud or in Crow Creek or in Lower Brule or in Cheyenne River or live in Sioux Falls or in Rapid City, when they ask me why we have not taken action on these bills, I don't know what to tell them. And so I want to thank my colleagues, those that are gathered here, as well as dozens of others who care about this issue, for trying to elevate this, to try to make sure that for all of the murdered and missing women and for all of the women who have been victimized, that we come together to acknowledge that this is not a rural problem, this is not an urban problem, this is an American problem, and it is time that we act. This time I'll turn it over to one of the leaders of this initiative, and one of the greatest advocates for these bills, again, Mr. Dan Newhouse.
Thank you, Trustee. I want to thank my colleagues for being here to express the importance of passing this legislation. I was asked by a reporter not too long ago about this legislation because these efforts have been going on for decades. And I was asked, what's different now? Why is today different than it was 20 years ago? Why do you think we can get something done? And my response was that the people I know on the American Indian tribes, the indigenous people throughout this country have had enough. They are fed up. They will not stand for this any longer. And they are rising up together to make sure that the United States Congress takes this necessary action. That's what's different. And that's why I think we're going to be successful. So we plead with you, Speaker Pelosi, please bring up these completely bipartisan bills. They're consequential. They will make a difference in so many people's lives. They are so important for this country. Thank you very much for your attention today. We look forward to a vote on these bills very, very soon.